Hello, welcome to the channel. Subscribe, leave a like, and don't forget to write a comment. Enjoy watching.
On Christmas morning, Dad tossed me a scratchy-looking red sweater with crooked stitching and said, half laughing, "We blew the budget just for you." The room erupted in casual chuckles. Mom gave her usual tight smile while clutching the coffee mug she always pretended had tea in it. Cole, of course, laughed the loudest, already wearing the new smartwatch he'd unwrapped 10 minutes earlier. I looked down at the sweater in my lap, a garment that somehow managed to feel both too small and too tired. And I just nodded, smiled, and said thank you, like I'd been trained to do since I was 6 years old. Then I reached down into my leather tote bag, took out a thin folder I had printed at the hotel business center the night before, and slid it quietly across the table toward my father, careful not to bump the platter of cinnamon rolls that no one had touched. I said, "You might want to look at this before the bank calls," then sat back in my chair and folded my hands together. His smirk didn't fade, at least not immediately, but when he opened the folder and started reading, I watched his fingers begin to tremble ever so slightly by the time he reached the final line. But let's not get ahead of ourselves. 3 days earlier, I was sitting on a delayed flight in Minneapolis, debating whether or not to just fake a fever and cancel the whole trip. My family had a long history of treating holidays like performance art, each one a carefully orchestrated series of forced smiles and passive-aggressive remarks that left you more exhausted than any airport layover ever could. I'd skipped the last 2 Christmases by claiming work emergencies, and no one had pushed back too hard, which in itself said everything you needed to know about how badly I was missed. This year, though, something felt different. There was a pull, not emotional, not nostalgic, but strategic. I had unfinished business to settle, and sometimes the most effective revenge doesn't require confrontation or theatrics. Just paperwork, patience, and a little well-timed silence. I arrived on the afternoon of the 23rd, dragging my black carry-on suitcase up the icy walkway of my parents' 2-story suburban home in Ohio, the same one they'd bought when I was 10, and never updated since. The shutters were still the same chipped hunter green. The porch light still flickered when it rained, and the wreath on the front door was the same one I remembered from middle school, with one bow permanently bent downward, like it was too exhausted to pretend anymore. My mother opened the door with a look that hovered somewhere between mild surprise and quiet resignation, as if she'd half expected I wouldn't come after all. She hugged me stiffly, patted my back like I was a visiting neighbor's child, then ushered me inside where the smell of baked ham and too much cinnamon-scented potpourri wrapped around my coat like a sticky film. Cole was already there, of course. He strolled into the foyer in socks and a branded hoodie from a startup he no longer worked at, holding a craft beer like it was an extension of his personality. He grinned and said, "Wow, look who made it, the ghost of Christmas deadlines." I forced a laugh and hugged him briefly, noting the new Apple Watch on his wrist and the fact that he still hadn't shaved, as if permanent stubble was part of some unsaid personal brand. Dinner that night was the usual blend of unspoken expectations and badly disguised hierarchy. My father asked about my job with the same thinly veiled skepticism he'd used since I left my corporate accounting role and started freelancing for private equity clients. "So you're still doing that online money stuff?" he asked, using the same tone someone might use to describe selling feet pictures on the internet. I explained again that I worked with early-stage tech investors on financial risk assessments and asset recovery strategies. He blinked, nodded once, and then turned to Cole, asking about his new business idea, something involving drones and AI and urban delivery, even though Cole's last 2 ventures had fizzled out faster than a sparkler in a rainstorm. The real kicker came when Mom, carving ham with unnecessary aggression, said, "Cole might need a little help getting it off the ground. We're thinking of co-signing on a line of credit to give him a boost." Then she looked at me and added, "You know, like how we helped him last time? We always believed in giving you both a leg up." I almost choked on my wine. They had never co-signed anything for me. Not the student loans I took out at 19, not the lease on my first apartment, not even the car I had to buy in cash when my old Civic finally gave up in winter. I had been told, more than once, that we can't afford to play favorites, while watching Cole get 3 birthday parties for turning 28, including a surprise Vegas trip that I wasn't invited to. I excused myself from the table and went upstairs under the guise of being tired. In truth, I needed a minute to breathe, to stare at the ceiling of the old guest room with its popcorn texture and posters from my teenage years, still pinned like fossils to the wall. That night, I lay on the squeaky twin bed in silence, staring at the folder I had pulled from my suitcase, rereading each line like it was a prayer I didn't believe in, but planned to recite anyway. The document had taken me 2 months to prepare. After overhearing a conversation between my dad and a cousin about Cole's latest loan, which, surprise, Dad had co-signed, I started digging. The loan had changed hands, passed through 2 regional banks, before landing in the hands of a struggling finance firm in Chicago. Through a shell LLC I'd set up for another client, I made an offer to acquire the debt, no questions asked. It was a small amount, relatively speaking, just over $65,000, but enough to make someone sweat if they thought the bank might call in the full note. When they handed me the rights, I didn't say a word. I held onto that paper like it was an ace, and I was waiting for the perfect hand to lay it down. And Christmas? That was the hand. That was always the hand. The next morning, I came downstairs to the smell of burnt toast and overcooked eggs. The tree lights were blinking erratically, and Cole was already snapping pictures of his new smartwatch to post online with some caption about hard work paying off. My parents beamed with pride as he opened a box labeled Equity Seed Gift, with a bow taped to a check. I sipped my coffee quietly and waited, because they always saved my gift for last, like it was some kind of tradition to make me feel special by default. And when Dad tossed me that sweater and laughed, "We blew the budget just for you," something inside me didn't snap. It crystallized. I thanked him, then reached into my bag, and everything began. It's funny how memory works. Not the dramatic, tear-streaked kind they show in movies, but the quiet, cumulative weight of being constantly passed over, as if the universe had penciled in your existence on a calendar that no one ever bothered to check twice. That weight builds not in moments of catastrophe, but in the 1,000 tiny humiliations that don't seem like much when they happen, yet somehow manage to etch themselves into your bones, slowly rearranging your sense of worth until you start to wonder whether you ever had any in the first place. I didn't grow up poor, and I wasn't unloved in the way people whisper about behind closed doors. But what I was, consistently, methodically, and with unsettling precision, was overlooked. And in our house, being overlooked came dressed in courtesy, camouflaged as respecting your independence. But the math was never hard to do. Cole got attention, and I got expectations. He got backup plans, and I got lectures about resilience. And year after year, present after present, holiday after holiday, I watched the same story play out. Cole fumbled, and we rallied. I succeeded, and they blinked like I'd tricked the system. When I was 14, Cole's birthday gift was a drum set that took up half the garage and kept the neighbors awake for months until he lost interest, while mine was a used copy of the 7 Habits of Highly Effective Teens with a half-written note inside that said, "You'll go far if you stay humble." At 16, I spent the summer working 2 part-time jobs, one scooping ice cream, the other babysitting kids who were already more self-assured than I'd ever been, just to save enough for a community college course in accounting, while Cole spent that same summer crashing my car into a tree because he thought it could handle off-roading, then shrugging as Dad paid the repairs and handed him the keys to his own vehicle 3 months later. I didn't even see it until Thanksgiving. By then, it already had a parking sticker from a campus he'd dropped out of twice, but the memory that lingered the most, carved into my chest like someone had taken a penknife to my ribs, was the night I came home during my 2nd year at the state university, the one I'd paid for entirely through scholarships and work study and caffeine-induced panic attacks. I had come home on a whim, without warning, hoping for a night of warmth, just one quiet dinner with my family. Instead, I walked through the door to find a banner strung across the kitchen archway that said, "Welcome home, Cole," in glittery red letters, flanked by trays of catered barbecue and a pile of gifts taller than the dog. I stood there, clutching my bag of laundry like an idiot, while my mother said, "Oh, Emma, you should have told us you were coming." She kissed my cheek absently, then handed me a paper plate. Cole, of course, had just dropped out of his entrepreneurial management program in Arizona and was taking time to reflect. That reflection included a ski trip, 3 months in Portland, and a sudden interest in NFTs that cost him thousands. He called it a learning curve. My dad called it finding himself. I called it bullshit, but only in my head, because any time I pointed out the discrepancy between how we were treated, my mother's mouth would tighten and my father would launch into a monologue about how life doesn't give out trophies for bitterness. They always made it sound like I was jealous, like the problem wasn't the uneven scale, but my inability to smile while balancing it. I moved out the moment I could afford to. Well, technically before that. I took a job at a logistics firm in Chicago, fresh out of school, and rented a studio apartment the size of a utility closet, with a crooked floor and water that ran brown for 30 seconds every morning. I didn't complain. I never did. I just worked and learned and figured things out. First for myself, then for clients, then for people with more money than sense. I built a name in a niche field no one in my family could even explain. And when I eventually started making more than all of them combined, I told no one. Not because I was hiding anything, but because I knew, instinctively, that they wouldn't believe me. Not really. They'd say, "Good for you," and then ask if I could help Cole with a budget spreadsheet. They always talked to me like I was the assistant to someone more important, someone with real ambition, someone like Cole. So when I got that call, 6 months ago, from my cousin Kevin, who works in mortgage lending, and somehow ended up reviewing the file on a line of credit that had Cole's name on it and my father's signature right beside it, something inside me clicked. I didn't react outwardly, I just asked for the file number and thanked him for the heads up. Then I spent the next 3 hours researching everything I could find. Loan history, origination date, balance owed, how many times it had been restructured, and most importantly, whether the debt had been sold. It had, twice, and the current holder was a boutique debt acquisition firm that had recently filed for reorganization, which meant they were offloading distressed assets at a discount. I knew what to do. I created an LLC, called it Sentinel Core Solutions, and had a proxy make the offer on my behalf. The entire thing cost me less than a third of what my father had once spent sending Cole to that business retreat in Tahoe, where he claimed he networked with visionaries and came home with nothing but hangover stories and a hoodie that said #startup life. I didn't feel vindicated when the contract cleared. I didn't feel powerful. I felt deliberate. It wasn't revenge, it was math. It was a spreadsheet finally balancing itself. When the transaction closed, I printed the paperwork and kept it in my bag. I didn't rush to use it. I waited. Because timing wasn't just important, it was everything. And now, sitting here in this house that still smelled like overcooked ham and false nostalgia, I knew the moment was close. They were doing it again, building up Cole's next collapse like it was the launch of a promising new venture, talking in warm tones about how everyone deserves a second chance, even if they've already burned through 3. My father, sipping lukewarm coffee from the mug I made for him in 6th grade art class, actually turned to me and said, "Emma, you're doing well. Maybe you can help your brother put together a pitch deck?" I said nothing, just smiled. Because Cole didn't know I already owned his future, and Dad didn't know he'd signed his name to mine. The morning after the dinner that made me feel once again like the lone unpaid extra in a family production that had already cast its stars and written my role in pencil, I woke up before anyone else, the house still dark and quiet, except for the low hum of the refrigerator and the occasional pop of the old heater struggling against the winter chill. I stood by the window in the guest room, a room that still had the peeling ballerina wallpaper from my childhood, as if my parents had never expected anyone worth visiting to sleep there again. And I watched the faint snow begin to fall across the dead garden below, each flake illuminated for a second under the porch light before disappearing into the crusted lawn like forgotten promises. My breath fogged the glass, and for a moment, I traced a line through the condensation with my fingertip, not out of nostalgia, but to remind myself that I was still here, still present, still real, even if no one in that house ever looked at me like I was. I didn't want to be there, not truly. And if I were being honest, I hadn't really come home for Christmas. Not for the tree, not for the stale sugar cookies, not for the performative traditions my mother insisted on even though no one enjoyed them. I'd come back because something inside me had shifted, not snapped. Snapping implies violence, a sudden break. No, this was something colder, older, more strategic. Something that had been building in layers over decades of being second-guessed, overlooked, and gently mocked by the people who were supposed to believe in me more than anyone else. I had reached a point where the idea of remaining silent felt like betrayal, not to them, but to myself. The night before at dinner, the conversation had spiraled in the same pattern it always did. My achievements distilled into vague acknowledgments, Cole's future bloated with exaggerated promise, my mother offering tight-lipped compliments followed by sharper, quieter barbs disguised as concern. "Emma, maybe you'd be happier if you weren't working so much. You always look so tired," she'd said, setting down a plate of green beans that no one touched. My father had nodded, adding, "You know, sometimes the smartest thing to do is let someone else take care of you." I smiled then, because the alternative was screaming, and I had never once screamed in that house, not even as a child. Cole, meanwhile, had launched into a story about his new project, a drone delivery service focused on artisanal dog food, while our parents listened like he was reciting a TED Talk, not regurgitating ideas he'd stolen from a podcast he didn't finish. No one asked me a single meaningful question, not about my clients, not about the cities I'd traveled to this year, not about the article I'd ghostwritten for a major financial magazine under a CEO's name. Instead, my father gestured to me mid-Cole monologue and said, "Emma probably knows a thing or two about that kind of stuff," before redirecting the conversation back to Cole, who was now explaining how he would corner the pet wellness market by the end of the year. It was laughable, and yet no one laughed. After dinner, I excused myself with the practiced grace of someone who knows. There is no applause waiting at the end of her scene, only quiet retreat. I took a long hot shower in the same bathroom where I'd once locked myself in during middle school because I'd overheard my mother tell an aunt that I was book smart but emotionally underdeveloped. The tiles hadn't changed, the medicine cabinet still squeaked, and the mirror still warped slightly on the left side, making your face look crooked if you stood too close. I looked at my reflection now, not crooked but clear, and I whispered, "It's not about the money anymore." Because that was the truth. It never really had been. If it were, I would have walked away the moment I got my first six-figure contract. If it were, I wouldn't have spent months researching, planning, waiting. No, it was never about the money. It was about recognition. It was about being seen not as a backup plan or an insurance policy, but as a force of my own. That night, while everyone else watched a Christmas movie downstairs, one of those saccharine, snow-dusted, small-town redemption stories where the daughter comes home and remembers her roots, I sat at the little desk in the corner of the guest room, opened my laptop, and connected to the hotel Wi-Fi I'd paid for in advance just in case theirs wasn't working again. I opened the folder labeled Holdco Files and scrolled through the PDF I'd read a dozen times, the legal language now as familiar to me as the shape of my father's disappointment. Page 1 detailed the transfer of debt, clean and airtight. Page 2 listed the terms of payment, due dates, interest accrued. Page 3 was the kicker, a formal demand letter, drafted and notarized, outlining the consequences of default. It was clinical, brutal, and inarguable. I printed the packet at a 24-hour business center 2 miles away and drove there in the middle of the night, the roads empty and glittering under the snowfall, my breath clouding in the rental car. The clerk barely looked up as I handed her my USB drive. She printed it in less than 5 minutes and handed it to me in a manila folder with a generic smile, the kind you give someone buying an insurance policy or returning a cable box. I said thank you, and I meant it, not to her but to myself, for finally doing something I should have done a long time ago. When I returned to the house, everyone was asleep. The television still played soft, muted commercials in the living room, the glow flickering against the ornaments like distant lightning. I walked quietly to the kitchen, poured myself a glass of water, and placed the folder on the dining table, right where my father always sat on Christmas morning. I didn't open it. I didn't reread it. I just let it sit there like a wrapped gift no one expected. I went back upstairs and lay in bed staring at the ceiling, waiting not for sleep, but for the sunrise. And I kept thinking I wasn't going to say anything. But sometimes silence is just the pause before the avalanche. By the time the sun had pushed through the heavy December clouds and spilled a dull gray light across the patchy snow outside our old house, I was already dressed, hair brushed, makeup minimal but precise, seated at the end of the long, cluttered dining table as if I were waiting for something official to begin. Like a verdict or a ceremony, something with finality, even if no one else realized it yet. My father emerged first, scratching his jaw and yawning like a man who'd slept too well for someone sitting on a ticking clock. He poured his usual burnt coffee, added too much sugar the way he always did when he wanted to seem easygoing, and gave me that same morning nod he'd given me every holiday for the past 10 years. Distantly warm, predictably shallow, the kind of gesture you give an employee you can't remember the name of. My mother came next, fussing with the thermostat and muttering about dry air, already dressed in a red sweater with a brooch shaped like a reindeer that had a missing eye and jingled slightly every time she moved, like some desperate attempt to wring festivity out of awkward tension. Cole was the last to appear, of course. He never rushed for anyone, not even during family holidays he claimed to cherish, but always arrived late too, hair slightly tousled in a way that probably took longer to achieve than a full shave. He had a new phone in hand, probably the one he'd needed for his latest business idea. And he was already scrolling through messages or maybe checking his crypto portfolio, whatever let him ignore the people sitting right in front of him. He dropped into the chair across from me, looked at the folder I'd placed on the table without touching it, and made some offhand joke about me always bringing work home, which got the chuckle from Dad that he was fishing for. That familiar, condescending rhythm between them that had never needed an audience because it thrived on being performed in front of me. Breakfast came in waves. First the eggs and bacon, then the cold pastries, then the inevitable pile of presents that had been arranged under the tree the night before with careful imbalance. Cole's name was on most of them, wrapped in thick gold ribbon, the kind you don't reuse because it's designed to scream value. Mine were smaller, fewer, wrapped in paper that had clearly been recycled from last year. The corner of one box still had remnants of a sticker that read "To Dad." And yet I didn't feel insulted or surprised. I felt clinical, aware of every pattern unfolding in perfect, pitiful symmetry, as if the whole event had been rehearsed dozens of times before I even stepped off the plane. When it came time for gifts to be handed out, my father, with his usual smirk and performative nonchalance, reached behind his chair and pulled out a small, squishy package with my name written in slightly smudged ink. He tossed it to me with the flair of a man delivering a punchline he'd already laughed at in his own head, and with a theatrical shrug said, "We blew the budget just for you this year, Em. Hope you like red." The room erupted in those awkward familial chuckles that aren't about humor at all, but rather about filling space with something other than silence. My mother gave him a light slap on the arm, as if to scold him playfully, and Cole raised his eyebrows like I should just be grateful someone remembered me at all. I opened the package slowly, peeling back the thin paper that had already begun to fray at the edges, and inside was exactly what I'd expected. A red sweater, oversized and itchy-looking, with a logo stitched on the sleeve that I recognized from a local bargain chain that had closed last year. It was the kind of gift that wasn't insulting because it was cheap. It was insulting because it was thoughtless, because it said, "We didn't think about what you'd actually want, and we're hoping you won't notice." I held it up, smiled like a pageant contestant, and said, It's perfect. In the exact tone I'd perfected by 17. Flat, pleasant, and utterly unreadable. Then, without another word, I reached down beside me, took the manila folder from the floor, and slid it across the table toward my father, the same way you'd slide a check after a tense meal when everyone knows the numbers don't add up, but no one wants to be the first to admit it. I looked directly at him, something I rarely did anymore, and said quietly but firmly, "You might want to look at this before the bank calls." The words hung in the air like frost, chilling the room in an instant. My father blinked, confused at first, then forced a chuckle, because that was his default defense, the same one he'd used every time I tried to confront him with the truth he didn't want to unpack. He opened the folder, and the chuckle died so slowly, so awkwardly, it felt like watching a balloon deflate through a pinhole. Page 1, the purchase agreement signed and sealed. Page 2, the terms of the loan he had co-signed for Cole, terms that had defaulted 3 months earlier. Page 3, the demand letter, legally binding, complete with acquisition date and payment deadline. I watched his fingers tremble, watched the heat drain from his face, as if someone had cut the power behind his eyes, and I didn't speak, because there was nothing else to say that wasn't already printed on that paper in black ink, in cold mechanical language that had no space left for denial. Cole leaned over his shoulder to read, his casual posture slowly collapsing into confusion, then disbelief, then rising panic. "Wait, what the hell is this?" he asked, voice cracking in a way I hadn't heard since we were kids, and he tried to lie about stealing from my piggy bank. My father looked up at me, mouth slightly open, his lips forming the start of a question he couldn't finish. And finally, after what felt like years of carefully orchestrated silence, I leaned forward, rested my elbows on the table like we were just two business partners working through a dispute, and said calmly, "It's your loan, your defaulted loan, and the company that owns the debt now, that's mine." My mother dropped her fork. Cole pushed his chair back hard enough to rattle the floor. And my father, always the man with a plan, the man who had an answer for everything, the man who once told me to stop acting smarter than everyone else in the room, sat frozen, speechless, eyes still scanning the page, like the outcome might magically shift if he just kept reading. But the ending had already been written, and I had just handed him the final chapter. There's a moment after the explosion, after the shockwave rolls through a room and leaves everything unnaturally still, where time doesn't quite move forward, but doesn't sit frozen either, where breath is held, words are stuck somewhere between throat and tongue, and the only sound that fills the space is silence laced with disbelief. That was the moment I sat in after sliding the folder across the table and watching, without flinching, as every assumption, every smug glance, every dismissive comment they'd ever thrown my way came crashing down around them like the brittle shell of a holiday ornament. The sweater they had given me, cheap, red, too small even in its symbolism, now sat abandoned on the chair beside me, a silent joke that no one had the courage to laugh at anymore. My father kept flipping the same page, over and over, as though the legal language might magically realign itself into something more forgiving, something that let him off the hook, something that didn't end with his name next to the words personally liable, as if denial was still an option after signatures had dried and debt had changed hands. Cole had risen to his feet by then, pacing in tight, aimless circles, his face red with a frustration that came not from injustice, but from exposure, from realizing that the very system he had coasted through his whole life, buoyed by undeserved faith and unconditional benefit of the doubt, had finally stopped catching him. And my mother, who always prided herself on keeping composure, now sat pale and trembling, one hand on the edge of the table like she might tip the whole thing over if it meant rewinding the last 5 minutes. No one spoke for a long time, and I didn't feel the need to fill the silence, because the silence was doing the work for me, unraveling the entire mythology they'd constructed around themselves. The noble parents who gave everything for their children, the brilliant son who just needed one more chance, the independent daughter who never wanted help. But that was never the story, was it? The real story was that Cole was handed lifeboats before he ever learned how to swim, while I was thrown into deep water and told that learning to float was character building. And the worst part, the part that gnawed at me during every lonely holiday, every belittling phone call, every invitation that never came, was not that they chose him over me. It was that they never even asked what I needed, not once. My father eventually cleared his throat, the sound grating and unfamiliar in a room that had grown hostile to noise. He said my name slowly, like it was something fragile, like maybe if he softened the tone, I might forget everything. "Emma, this can't be right," he muttered, gesturing to the documents as though they were some kind of illusion, a prank gone too far. I tilted my head slightly, not in sympathy, but in measured disbelief, because even now, even when faced with the printed proof of their failure and my quiet triumph, he still thought I might walk it back out of some residual need for approval. But the truth was, I didn't need approval anymore. I hadn't needed it in years, and the fact that he hadn't noticed that, even now, was all the confirmation I required. "This is right," I replied, my voice calm, deliberate, and devoid of the emotion he was fishing for. "You co-signed a business loan for your son, again, and he defaulted. The debt was sold, I bought it, and now I own it. There's nothing illegal about it, nothing hidden, nothing underhanded. It's all there. You just didn't expect me to be the one holding the paper." Cole slammed a hand down on the table, the kind of gesture that might have intimidated someone else, somewhere else, sometime earlier in his life. But now, standing in front of me with no pitch deck to hide behind, no parental buffer to soak up the blame, and no way to spin the consequences as part of his learning curve, he looked like what he had always been underneath the arrogance. A boy playing the role of a man, furious that the game had changed without his permission. "You're just gonna ruin Christmas to make a point?" he snapped, as if the holiday were sacred, as if I hadn't spent the last 15 Christmases sitting through his meltdowns, cleaning up his messes, or getting tossed whatever emotional scraps remained after he'd consumed the bulk of our parents' time, energy, and money. I turned to him then slowly, deliberately, and said, "You ruined Christmas the day you decided someone else would always pay for your mistakes. I just finally made sure you were right." He stared at me, open-mouthed, unable to respond, because deep down, even under all that entitlement, he knew I wasn't wrong. My mother finally spoke, voice shaking, her words stumbling over each other like they were trying to get out before she lost the nerve. "Emma, sweetheart, surely we can talk about this. Maybe come to an arrangement." The irony hit me like a slap. Now she wanted to talk. After years of shutting down my concerns with platitudes and polite distance, after years of acting like my presence was a seasonal inconvenience, she finally wanted a dialogue. But I wasn't here for negotiations. I was here for closure. "There's no arrangement," I replied, my gaze steady. "There's only the debt. You can pay it, or you can face the consequences. The same consequences I would have faced, alone, had it been me who defaulted. And we both know what you would have said then. You would have told me to learn from it." I stood up then, smoothed my coat over my shoulders, and picked up the sweater I would never wear. I didn't need to say goodbye. They weren't listening anyway. As I walked toward the door, I paused for a moment, just long enough to glance back at the wreckage I had left, not with shouting or vengeance or fury, but with documents, with facts, with power they had never imagined I possessed. I looked at my father one last time. Not with hate, not even with disappointment, but with something colder, indifference. "I asked for one thing once," I said quietly, "not money, not gifts, just for you to see me. Not as someone who needed to be saved, not as someone who owed you gratitude, just as someone who didn't deserve to be ignored." And then I walked out into the pale morning light, the snow crunching beneath my boots, the air so crisp it made my lungs ache in the best way. I didn't look back. I didn't need to. I knew the weight of what I'd left behind. Inside my bag, nestled between my laptop and the leftover pastries I had packed from the kitchen, as a petty joke to myself, was a fourth page no one had seen. It wasn't part of the demand letter. It wasn't legal or binding or necessary. It was a note, short, handwritten, unsentimental. It read, "This was never about punishment. It was about proof. You taught me how to survive. I taught myself how to win." And I had quietly, completely, unforgivably, because sometimes the only way to be seen is to stop asking.